Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. So I'm just going to say a few words about our speaker today. The Department of International Relations and International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism of the National Research University High School of Economics is holding the 35th session of our Eurasian online seminar. Our guest today is a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland and research associate at the Institute of China Studies of the University of Malaya, Dr. Michael Tai. The topic of his talk is what factors determine trust between the states, the case of US-China relations. Dr. Michael Tai is the author of US-China Relations in the 21st Century, A Question of Trust, that's by Routledge 2015, and China and Her Neighbors, Bloomsbury 2019. There are also other various book chapters, scholarly articles about China's external relations. Dr. Michael Tai taught at the University of Cambridge, the Belarusian State Economics University, the American University in Central Asia, and the Beijing Institute of Technology. He earned his bachelor's degree and master's degree in engineering from Cornell University, MBA from the University of Cambridge, MA in theology from Regent College, and PhD in international relations from the University of Cambridge, where he explored the US-China relations in the areas of finance, climate, and security policy. Dr. Michael Tai also has rich experience as a management consultant and CEO of companies in the steel and public transportation sectors in Malaysia. He's a prominent contributor to the South China Morning Post, CGTN, and The Diplomat. He also contributed to the development of the international relations theory and explored a view to develop a theory of international relations which may better explain China's foreign policy. Those of you who are familiar with the format of the seminar, we are going to start with a speaker's talk and have a Q&A session at the end. If you're comfortable, please raise your hand and ask a question directly or put your name and question in the chat. And we'll try to accommodate everybody who wishes to interact with the speaker. Professor Tai, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, everybody. I'm really excited to be able to speak on this seminar. I want to thank Professor Lukin for inviting me, and I would, without further ado, like to talk about the topic of trust between states. Well, why do we need to talk about trust? And the reason for that is because of, I can't seem to move my slides.
There are arrows. Right.
Oh, okay, good. Yes. The reason why I wanted to talk about trust is because it has to do with cooperation between states. Now, we as a human species, we are at a very important crossroads. In fact, a very critical crossroads in our history. And this is a time when we have to deal with many global challenges. And these are existential challenges, which really affects the survival of the human species. Three of these challenges that I want to talk about, or that I'm concerned about, is climate change. Now, we've already seen a lot of that happening in many parts of the world. In the developing world, in the global south, as well as the global north. And these creates a lot of problems, just for people's livelihoods, and also creates a lot of migration, as we see in what is happening in parts of Europe now, and also in Southeast Asia. The other crisis that we face is financial crisis. These financial crises, they take place every 10 years or so. And the last one we had was in 2008. That was the Wall Street financial crisis. And that crisis brought about a lot of dislocation, economic dislocation around the world. Many economies went into recession. And we were almost, well, in many places, we also went into a depression. So we've almost, now that was 2018. And we have so come out of that in large part. But if the theory is correct, then we will be expecting another financial crisis before long. So because the global economy, the global financial system is so interconnected, well, if the Wall Street crisis, well, it started in Wall Street in America, but its effect was felt all over the world. And this will happen again. And so it is important for us to find ways to deal with this. And the only way to deal with this is, again, through cooperation between the big economies. And in this case, we're talking about the United States, China, and of course, many of the countries of the G7. And a financial crisis needs to be tackled as a global community. Now, the third issue is international security. There has been, since the Second World War, we've had wars in many parts of the world with very few interruption. And this could lead to, of course, we're seeing the war in Ukraine now. We had a war in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, and these have serious impact on people around the world. So in order to deal with the security issues, well, again, we need to have cooperation between the major powers. But cooperation between the major powers is predicated on trust. Without trust, it is impossible to cooperate. And so I worked out a framework on how to analyze trust, to look at what are the factors that develop or build trust between states. And the first one I want to talk about is history. History, well, of course, history is, let me put this back here. History is the relationship between two countries, isn't it? It's the memories that they have. And if two countries that have good memories together are more likely to trust each other than those that have bad memories. And I can cite a few examples of countries or pairs of countries that have good memories. First, of course, on a good history side, we have the US and the UK, which have worked together. I mean, they have a very special relationship. Although in the beginning the Americans fought a war of independence against the British, but since then they have worked very closely together, worked together through the First World War and the Second World War, and because of these shared experiences and shared alliances, they have a very strong relationship. And of course, on top of that, it's the Anglo-Saxon. And they do have a shared history of going further back, coming from the same origins in the British Isles. And on another good example of good history is China and Pakistan. Pakistan was formed in 1947 after the partition with India. And since the very beginning, China has been very supportive of Pakistan, has provided Pakistan with economic aid as well as military aid. And of course, we also know about the tension between India and Pakistan. So China has stood by Pakistan for all these decades. And therefore, the relationship between them is very strong. They call it an all-weather friendship. Now, on the other side, on the bad history side, we have many examples. Unfortunately, there's the example of Germany, Poland, Russia. Poland was partitioned 3 times in modern history. So there's been a lot of trauma between these three countries, up through to the Second World War, invasion of Poland by Germany, and then after the end of the war, Poland was part of the Warsaw Pact in Russia. So it's a very complicated and traumatic history. There are millions of Poles were killed during the Second World War in concentration camps, Auschwitz, We know many of those events. There was Katyn as well, where Polish officers were executed. So it's a very difficult relationship, even till today, in terms of building trust. Then we have the other example of Japan and Korea. Japan invaded Korea in 1895, occupied Korea. Korea was a Japanese colony for 50 years. It was a very brutal rule, and Koreans have very bitter memories of Japanese colonial rule. So that even till today, it's a relationship between the two sides. It's still very sensitive. Now, of course, if you ask about the history of US and China, the history of US and China has many zigzags, many ups and downs. There were periods where the relationship was good and periods where it's not so good. Of course, America and China stood side by side and fought together against Japan during the Second World War. But at the end of that war, China fought a war in Korea against the United States. There's the Korean War, and that was a very bloody war, and that has left very bitter memories on both sides. But later there was rapprochement. Both sides decided to make peace with each other. This was during the 1970s. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, President Nixon, made his historic trip to China, and they established diplomatic relations. And China opened up in the 1970s, 78. And that was the beginning of a big change for Chinese economic development. And the United States played a very supporting role in that. It embraced China, welcomed China into the WTO in the year 2000. And the rest of that is history. We saw how China's economy grew from a very poor country, and in a span of 20 to 30 years, its economy is now the second, and some even say it's the first, depending on how you measure the GDP. But then again, now in recent years, we have another turn ever since President Trump. America has taken a harder stance against China, and the relationship now, some describe it as the worst it's ever been since the 1970s. So history has a big part to play in building trust. Now, the other thing, the second factor I want to look at is interest, and by this I mean national interest, particularly the interest of the elite. The national elite of two countries, of both sides. So you have to look at whether their interests clash or converge. If they clash, then there's less likelihood of building trust. It's harder to build trust. But if they converge, if they share the same interests, then things look much better, much more optimistic. Now, of course, we can look at trust between colonies and the metropole. It's a long history of colonization by European great powers across the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, East Asia as well as Southeast Asia. So all that has left bitter memories in the colonies of the period of colonial rule. And sometimes it is difficult to build trust because of that. And then we have this tension between the global north and the global south. The global north, of course, are the industrialized countries, and global south, the developing countries. So the interests do not converge. Especially on the economic side. The conditions that are needed for economic development require each side to to take different steps. The North would like to continue to control the resources of the South, and the South would like to develop and become prosperous and develop and have their day in the sun. So these are conflicting aims, conflicting ambitions. And then, of course, we have the capitalist states. Even among the capitalist states, there could be clash of interests. There's a clash, a competition over markets. So once again, if we look at the case of the US and China, there is a lot of, well, there is cooperation as well as competition, or rather, there is synergy as well as conflict, where as far as Sino-American trade ties, investment ties are concerned. China has benefited a lot through joining the global economy, and a lot of has seen, for instance, the elevation of poverty. In the last 30 years, China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, according to the IMF. And this is a sort of unprecedented achievement, and that 800 million accounts for something like 3/4 of the poverty alleviation during that period around the world. And of course, we have seen the rise of the Chinese middle class, and also some large Chinese companies, and we've seen Chinese companies, taking the lead in many important sectors, such as high-speed rail, such as power generation, nuclear power plants, 5G, and so on. And at the same time, America has also benefited a lot through this because of the trade. I mean, China has produced a lot of inexpensive goods for the American consumers, and that has helped to keep down American inflation. So it's a mixed picture of whether the interests between China and the US converge or clash. They clash in certain ways and they converge in other ways. But in the last couple of years, we've seen the Americans taking a much stronger stance against China, to contain China and to prevent China from taking leadership in certain key technologies, such as semiconductors. Now, the next area I want to talk about is structures. Now, by structures, I mean these institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, WTO. These are mostly to do with trade and finance, but there are institutions such as the NATO, the Quad, the AUKUS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which are much more in the area of politics, and in some cases, especially in the case of NATO, it's the military alliance. So these alliances are structures that affect the ability to build trust between the two sides. I mean, if one side is in an alliance that is antagonistic to the other side, we can see that the possibilities for engagement are lower. And then, of course, we have the OPEC, we have the BRICS, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. These are all important initiatives, and it depends on which side you fall on, whether you are a member of one or a member of the other, and whether they see a benefit in cooperating, or whether there are ideological differences between these groups, these global groupings. And then we have treaties. There are many international treaties, such as the Paris Accord, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and then we have supply chains. These are very consequential today because of the globalized economy. We have all seen the impact on our lives and on businesses because of disruption in supply chain due to the ongoing clash between the US and China. And then, of course, the SWIFT payment system, the dollar hegemony. Then there's these all concern business and economics. And then there's also the media. The media is very powerful. The media is a very powerful institution because the media is able to control narratives. It is able to tell the story for one side or for the other, or one side against the other. And so we see, a lot of debates about that, whether you can trust what the BBC says or what the New York Times and Washington Post, what you see on YouTube and Twitter and so on. So these are very, very powerful organizations which can affect the trust between two sides. And then, of course, we have social structures such as nationalism, racism. I mean, these are not formal structures, but they are there nonetheless. They are the background music of relations between two countries. So, and finally, I want to touch on empathy. This is the fourth factor. Now, empathy is putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Relationship between the two states is like relationship between two people. In fact, it is the relationships between two countries is the relationship between the leaders and the elites of these two countries. If the elites of both sides have a good, cordial relationship, then you can expect trust. I mean, we see that that trust growing, say, between Russia and China, between President Xi Jinping and President Putin. They seem to have hit it off really well, even in an informal sort of a way. They got on really well when Xi Jinping attended the Winter Olympics in Sochi. So there is a certain amount of chemistry as well at that level, and yeah, and the thing about trust is that trust is built on cognition. It's built on knowledge. It's built on how much you know about the other side, how much you understand the other side. The person's background, how he thinks, his likes and dislikes, what his interests are. But it's also deeply affected by emotion and perception. International relations, we often talk about international relations between states. We talk about rational choice theory, that states, they will look at all the available options and they will pick the best, the option or the policy that gives that promises the best outcome in a rational sort of way. But that's not always, or in fact, that doesn't always happen, and we've seen that in many instances. Perception plays a very important part. Perception is based on many things. It's based on one's culture, where you're raised, when you're grown up, your education, and that colors your vision. So everything is not based on fact alone. And we will come back and talk about this in a moment. The example that I like to give is during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Llewellyn Thompson, he was he had served in Russia as a U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he got to know Nikita Khrushchev very well. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev was sent a message to President Kennedy, and Llewellyn Thompson, he read the message and he understood where Khrushchev was coming from, and so he spoke to Kennedy and explained that, and that was one of the key factors in resolution of that crisis. Now, these are the four factors in the framework, but I would like to take a few minutes to talk about something else. I want to talk about culture. International relations, we don't talk about culture very much, and I think it is important. When two countries, it is important in terms of to the degree that it affects your perception of the other, or your ability to understand where the other is coming from. And so here I would like to compare American values with Chinese values. Now, these I'm talking about social and cultural values. So on the one side, we, in America, the first one is the freedom. Americans have a great, put a lot of weight on, put a lot of emphasis on freedom. And whereas the Chinese, the emphasis on harmony. And now this, of course, has to do with the way, the history of the country. America is quite new. It's only about 250 years old. And it is a new country. It was built on exploration. It's built on new institutions. The settlers to America came from England, and they came because they wanted to get away from the old world, facing religious persecution in England, and the people were left on the Mayflower. The Puritans came to England because. To the United States because they wanted to found a new world with new values and new institutions. So that birth of America is full of creative energy. It's full of energy of wanting to create something new virtually out of nothing. It's a new place, a new world, new possibilities. So you see that as is very much a part of the American character. Whereas China, on the other hand, has a long history, a written history about 3,500 years, and it's it is an agrarian country which has suffered through history a lot of calamities, especially floods and famine. So in China, because the population is large. It is, when Americans came to North America, there were the Native American Indians, but there was a lot of open space, a lot of open land. China is just the opposite. It's densely populated, and then on top of that, you have to face a lot of calamity. It is very hard to survive alone on yourself as an individual. To survive in that kind of environment, you need to be part of a group. You need to learn how to live with a group, and you need to be dependent on each other. It's like a team. You can't survive alone. You have to work as a team. And so that has become very much a part of the Chinese psyche, and that's how Chinese society is structured. Next, and so I go on to number two, and which is independence and interdependence. So that comes from the first, comes from the same historical reasons, and individualism versus collectivism, or anarchy versus hierarchy. The Chinese American society prefers informality. When I say anarchy, I don't mean political anarchy. I mean a social anarchy, in the sense that Americans don't reject the idea of being controlled by anybody. Well, there's also that aspect of political anarchy where you do see many Americans who prefer small government to big government, including people in the Republican Party. Whereas in China, it is a more collective society where people work in groups, and where you have to be conscious of what other people in the group think. So the group, in many sense, is more important than the self. Now, this, of course, is not just China. This applies across all the East Asian countries, meaning countries that have Confucian culture, where the culture is based on Confucianism, and which includes China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, and to some degree Singapore as well, because it has a very large Chinese population. So in these Confucian societies, its collectivism is very much a part of the DNA, where the individual. So for instance, Japan is a classic case. If you go to Japan, you find that people are not so ready to speak their mind, because they have to be very careful whether they would offend somebody. And if you in a classroom, a classroom in the US and a classroom in Japan is completely different. In the US, you are encouraged to offer your opinion. You're encouraged to offer opinion, but not in Japan. in a classroom in Japan, it's not uncommon where the students don't say anything. They hardly say a word. And that's true as well in Korea and in China. And then, yeah, and the next thing is this culture of guilt and shame. Well, guilt, I think this is, the guilt is about how I feel about myself. Say if I did something wrong or I did something that was, that broke certain norms, I feel guilty, and that is my sense of myself, how I feel about myself. Whereas shame is different. Shame is this feeling of, is this concern or worry about what others think about me. So that has, I mean, that plays into many aspects of life, including, as I mentioned earlier, in the classroom. If you raise your hand and you say something that is incorrect, you feel shame. Children in Asia are socialized by shame, and that is something that it needs to be. So for instance, in a debate, like say in a classroom where you have American students and you have Chinese students sitting in the same classroom, the dynamic is very peculiar, because you have the Americans who are very vocal, and you have the Chinese who refrain from speaking, or if they do say something, and if their opinion is rebutted, or somebody offers a counter argument, they immediately pull back, because they feel that their opinions, if their opinion is rejected, it almost feels as if they are rejected as a person. So this goes much further deeper, and these are matters that need to be taken on board when it comes to cross-cultural interaction or international relations. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is asymmetry. In the case of the US and China, there is a big asymmetry in many areas. And by this, I mean asymmetry of knowledge. You see, in China, China is a developing country. Well, and this goes back a long time. I mean, there's a history of over 100 years, because China was started with the Opium War. It was defeated by the British and the French, and they had to open up their ports, open up China to trade by Western powers, and that was a very traumatic development for China. That trauma is still there. This trauma that they somehow lost out. They were defeated, and for a long time, China was very poor. After the Second World War, from 1945 up until the 1970s, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. There was very little development, whereas other countries had already taken off. Even their neighbors, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore had already developed. And of course, the West, the industrialized West, had gone even further. So because of that, there is a sense of, well, we talked about guilt and shame. So there is a deep sense of shame in the Chinese psyche for being undeveloped, and so it wants to catch up. It wants to learn from the West, and it has sent students to overseas, to America, to UK, and to Japan, to all the developed countries. So it has put a lot of emphasis on education. And a part of it, of course, is because of the Confucian philosophy. Confucianism places a heavy emphasis on education. Education in China is seen as one of the key ways in which you can move up in society, social mobility. So yes. So I mean, China, well, not just China. I would say most of Asia, most of East Asia, sees itself as as behind and wants to learn from the West. And so it puts a lot of emphasis on education. Well, not just about mathematics and science, but also about education about, say, the English language, learning English. The Chinese put a heavy emphasis, premium on learning English. Parents will spare no expense to send their kids, even in kindergarten or elementary school, to extra English language classes. I'll show you later a few more statistics on that. But yeah, if you compare the number of people learning Chinese, learning English in China to the number of Americans learning Chinese, the difference is enormous. In China, there are about 300 million people, or I think it's 400 million people learning English. Now, 400 million, that is bigger than the entire population of the United States. It's 1/3 the population of, it's 1/3 the population of China, but the US population is about 350 million. So you see the disparity, and then in terms of students, Chinese students going to study in America. There are about 350,000 Chinese students in America, and only about it's only about 20,000 American students studying in China. And there are also other cultural influence. Now, let me here. I like to. Well, so the language study is one thing, but on top of that, there's also a huge interest in learning about Western society and Western history. These are all, you see I'll show you in a moment, the history questions in the high school or the university entrance examination questions that the Chinese students take in the history paper. So if you bear with me, I'll show you these. Sorry. Okay.
Professor Tai, did it freeze or?
No, yeah, yes, I'm hoping that the people okay, maybe I'll read it. Sorry, let me back up a bit. Okay, well, the first question is, which monarch worked as a sailor and carpenter while visiting the West incognito? I'm sure my Russian students will know the answer.
That's the most popular story in schools. So
the next one is arrange the following persons or events in historical sequence of the Puritan Revolution. That's the English Puritan Revolution, and describe the political changes that took place during that period. Mind you, I mean, of course, these questions were all written in Chinese. I took the liberty to translate them into English. And so you see the restoration of the House of Stuart, the execution of Charles I, William and Mary, King James I, and you are asked to put them in a historical time sequence. Which event happened first. And then another question is, it talks about migration. Mid-19th century saw large-scale migration in Europe and America. From 1846 to 1975, 9 million people left Europe. A majority of them went to America. And what was the main reason for that? So, whether it was plantation owners in America needed farm workers, genocide broke out in Europe, European imperialist aggression intensified, US government encouraged immigration. Yeah, you don't have to answer the question. It's just to show you the sort of material that they examine on. In classical Greek, democracy comes from demos and kratos. And this suggests that democracy in ancient Greece emphasized, these are the four: broad citizenship participation, private property, trial by jury, democratic rights. So, and this one is, oh, by the way, this exam was, this is from the 2009 paper. So the students would sit for this, they're 18-year-olds. So
Very
the 2000.
But demos is not the people, by the way.
This one.
Yes, demos is not the people. Demos are people who live in the dem, not all the people.
Right. Right. So in other words, the democracy is not what we imagine it to be. That sort of one person, one vote, right? Is that what you?
Well, it does mean, because the meaning of the word can change over time, but so it doesn't really matter what it meant in Greece. Greek democracy was very different from what we mean by democracy today. Actually, what we mean by democracy today, the Greeks would call oligarchy, I think.
Yes. You had to, it was only a small group of people who could actually vote, wasn't it? In ancient Greece.
No, in ancient Greece, democracy meant the power of poor people, kind of. And our democracy is the power, and it also meant direct democracy. But we don't have direct democracy. The representative democracy they called oligarchy in ancient Greece. So it's a complicated question. So it does.
Right. Yes, yeah. Maybe it's a bit too much for 18-year-olds, high school students. So this is this was the 2009 Summit of the Americas, where President Chavez gave President Obama a book, and they asked to name the title of the book is La Venas Abiertas de la America Latina. So the open veins of Latin America. So they are asked to comment on that, about the meaning of that title. Whether it was the outbreak of wars of independence, or whether it was about Western colonial exploitation, or whether it was a congenital defect among the population, or whether it was a healthcare crisis. Now this is another one on European history. It's about France's defeat in 1815, London's triumph over Paris, how France lost its superpower status following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and how London overtook Paris as the great commercial center, and then they asked to give the answers on that. This question is more about a Chinese communist, about Chinese revolution, the strategy that the Chinese revolution that they took during the first half of the 20th century. What was their unique strategy? And then this is about Japan, Meiji Restoration, talks about the cultural changes, societal changes that were taking place at that time, how the Japanese adopted Western dress, but at the same time, they still kept wearing their kimonos. You had coffee bars, but tea houses were still popular. They watched European operas, but also continue to to enjoy their traditional opera, the No and the Kabuki. So anyway, the reason why I show these questions is to give a flavor of what the Chinese learn in school in history. So next, I'd like to show you what Americans learn in school in history. This textbook called American Pageant is a very popular American high school textbook. Alexandra has seen this book, has used this book herself. So I was quite surprised to hear that. So I want to show you a little bit of the content. What is it? What are the topics that they cover in the history textbook? Now, of course, it's American history. So as you would expect, most of the topics are about America from very early to modern day. So you have the plantations, you have the settling of the colonies, you have life in the 17th century, and then you have the Revolution, talks about the American Revolution and how it's seceding from the empire, from England. And then move on to Constitution and the founding of the American state, Jeffersonian democracy, and the surge of nationalism, forging of the economy. I think somewhere along there's also the Civil War. Oh, here, yes. It talks a bit about slavery in the South. And then it goes on to talk about the crisis of the Union, the North and the South, and how that led to the American Civil War. And then and then this goes on until the Gilded Age, the early 1900s, the Great Depression, and then the Roaring '20s. And then so on, and it goes on, until the Eisenhower era, America's involvement in the Second World War, and then post the Second World War into the 60s and until the 90s. So it's basically an overview of American history right from the beginning. But there is no there's no instruction, no lessons on world history. Now, I understand that there is an option that you can take, but there's a very small number of students take that in comparison to the population of America. Now, I think this sets things up for in America. It's become the society is very parochial in that sense. I was as a teenager in America at Cornell. When I told my friends that I came from Malaysia, they asked me which part of Africa is that, and I was even more amused when they asked me if I had roller skates and ice cream in my country. So many of them, of course, they haven't been overseas, they haven't traveled. I just checked again, and about 37% of Americans hold passports. That's to me, that's a bit surprising for an affluent country like that. But even so, I think it's just there seems to be a lack of curiosity about other places and other peoples, and this is something that worries me. So I wanted to go back to this thing about I was saying earlier, this comparison between number of Chinese learning English and the number of Americans learning Chinese. You see the disparity in numbers here, and also the disparity in numbers between Chinese students. There's 300,000 students in America and 2,500 Americans in China. And so that's as far as education goes. But then on top of that, you have other things. You also have like the film. The Hollywood movies are very, very popular in China. They regularly break box office records, and I mean the Chinese make their own movies as well, but they really enjoy Hollywood movies, and so through the movies they learn a lot about America, and also acquire a lot of, they understand and learn a lot about American values. Let me show this. So you see, this is, you have here Hollywood in China, and this is the Jurassic, the latest Jurassic movie, I think it's Jurassic Part 3, and now it made 53 million on just over one weekend. And, you know, again, it's the best box office weekend in 3 months. So that is as far as movies concerned. And then sports. The Chinese are big fans of the NBA. They have their own, they have the official NBA website, a Chinese website. And China is the biggest market for the NBA outside of North America. And so then I like to go back to, yes, so that's the movies. And of course, music. Music is also a big part. If you listen to Chinese music now, it sounds very much like American music. I mean, they have rap, they have, you know, if you were not listening to the lyrics, you couldn't tell. I mean, you would think that it was an American song. Well, by the way, I mean, it's the same in Japan and Korea. K-pop and J-pop, the rhythm and the melody is completely Western. There's nothing Japanese or you know, Chinese about the rhythm. Fast food is taken over. I mean, of course, everybody knows China has got a lot of great food, but fast food, McDonald's, KFC, and so on, they have become they're everywhere. Coca-Cola, Pizza Hut. So there is a many of this American food is considered fashionable. It's you know, young people like to go to these places in China, Japan, and Korea. Fashion. If you go to China today, or even yeah, people don't know. You hardly see people wearing the traditional Chinese dress. Everybody is in you know, Western fashion, jeans and T-shirt and so on. I mean, so Western taste, Western fashion, Western movies, they are all, the Chinese identify that with modernity. So to be modern is to be Western. And then, as I said, I'll talk about sports. So there is this huge asymmetry. One side knows so much more than the other. You know, these Chinese kids, they would know what are the best, you know, who is Iron Man, and you know, a lot of these American pop culture characters. But you wouldn't be able to find any, hardly find any. It'd be very rare to find an average American who's watch a Chinese movie or listen to a Chinese song, or you know a Chinese novel. You know, let alone about Chinese history. So this asymmetry is not good, you know, when it comes to talking about international relations, about how two sides can build trust to cooperate. That is my concern. Now, what about? I mean, will things change? I don't know. I mean, will America become more open to the outside world? Will their curriculum, education, the sort of textbooks they use, will that change? Will there be more programming about China on television? That is an open question. What is the American mindset? Is there a willingness to try and know more about other countries, not just China, you know, Japan, Korea, Russia, Turkey, or South Africa, yeah. So I think that's a real challenge. I mean, it's, you know, if America or Americans were a small country, maybe that question isn't that important. But for a country, but for a superpower, Americans need to be more informed, because they have such great capacity for good and for evil. So in terms of what they're able to learn, I like to, some of you may remember Robert McNamara. He was the defense secretary during Kennedy, he served under Kennedy and also President Johnson. He was the Secretary of Defense. And he was the one, he was the architect, or rather he was the defense secretary during the Vietnam War. America's long involvement in Vietnam, the surge in the number of troops. At first, there were, the American troops were in the thousands in Vietnam, but later, during his time, they went up to 50,000. So large numbers of troop increase. After of course, America withdrew from Vietnam, and after he retired, he wrote his memoirs. I believe it was 1996. And I'd like to show you a quotation from his memoir. This is what he wrote about Vietnam. He said, what went wrong was a basic misunderstanding of the threat to our security represented by the North Vietnamese. It led President Eisenhower to say that if Vietnam were lost, the dominoes would fall. That was the theory at the time, that if Vietnam falls, then other parts, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, the whole of Southeast Asia would fall to communism. That was their belief. Now, and he says, I'm certain we exaggerated the threat. We didn't know our opposition. We didn't understand the Chinese. Of course, the Chinese were involved in Vietnam to the extent that they supported the Vietnamese. They provided the Vietnamese with material. We didn't understand the Vietnamese. So the first lesson is to know your opponents. So, I mean, for America saw the war in Vietnam as a war against communism. They saw the Vietnamese as basically trying to spread communism. But that wasn't the case. I mean, the Vietnamese were really fighting for independence first from the French, which they defeated in 1954 in Dien Bien Phu. And then, of course, the Americans intervened, and so they had to fight the Americans too. So it wasn't about spreading communism. It was about just gaining their independence in the same way that the Americans fought the British during the American War of Independence, or called the American Revolution. So it's very sad that the Americans didn't see that, and the reason for that, to a large part, is because of a lack of understanding, lack of knowledge. The cognitive part was missing. Didn't really understand Vietnamese history, or why the Vietnamese, what were they fighting for. That part was missing. And then on top of that, a lot of it was perceptions. It was just perception of the Vietnamese, the very wood communists conjures all kinds of bad images in the American mind. And with that, of course, comes emotions. There's this anger, there's resentment. And so when you put all that together, this is what you get. Large numbers of young Americans died in Vietnam. Thousands, died, and of course, even more were wounded. Well, not to mention the Vietnamese. There were even more Vietnamese who died. Even till now, because of the chemical weapons that the Americans use in Vietnam, Agent Orange. Till today, you still have large areas that cannot be planted because there's completely poison. Land that's completely poisoned, and children that are born without eyes and without hands and legs. So he says the first lesson is to know your opponents. And he says, I want to suggest to you that we do not know our potential opponents today. He wrote this in 1996. So that's some 20-something years ago. Has American leadership changed? Have people taken heed of his warning? So this is this statement is 2013. This is about 9 years back, or some, what is it? Some 15 years after. That was 1996 for 17 years. Yeah, 17 years after McNamara, a lot of things happened. Yeah, after the Vietnam War, America then got involved in the Middle East with 9/11. Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Iraq. And many other places which we don't hear about in the news. America has been fighting wars virtually non-stop in one part of the world or the other, either covert or overt. Including the war in Ukraine now. So this was written in 2013. This is H.R. McMaster. He was the U.S. National Security Advisor, but he led troops. He was an officer in the U.S. Army, and he led troops in Iraq. I believe it was 2005, 2006. And this is what he has to say. Our record of learning from previous experience is poor. One reason is we apply history simplistically, or we ignore it altogether. So yeah, it's I think, you know, part of it goes back to the education system. Part of it goes back to a certain degree of parochialism, a lack of interest in knowing about other cultures, and of course this stems to the fact that America is indeed a superpower. You know, whether it's the economy, the military, it has no peer. So it is easy to feel that sense of primacy. That sense of primacy, and indeed it is American official policy, you know, defense white paper, to perpetuate that hegemony. America is not ready to step back and be one among equals. So with that policy in place, with that mindset among the political class, American political class, then it raises the question of what are the prospects for trust, what are the prospects for peace, and what are the prospects for war. Especially at a time, just at the moment when we are faced with huge global challenges that demand or require global cooperation. At a time when we have to fight these existential threats together, it's not happening. I think Europe is a little bit different because, I mean, Europe has a much longer history. So maybe the longer the history, the more cautious you are. With a shorter history, maybe first of all, the memory is shorter. I mean, those of us who have lived long, the longer we live, the more mistakes we make, yeah. And we all know the mistakes we make and how we have to live with them. So the question is, yeah, maybe I'll leave this to later. peace is a very precious thing and can't be taken for granted. So I think I'll stop here, if that's okay, and take some questions.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful talk at the intersection of, I'd say, psychology, international relations, philosophy as well. So all of the things in one talk. Would any of the participants like to have a comment, question? I'm sure this was thought-provoking for everybody. Professor Lukin, would you like to start?
Well, yes, there are a lot of interesting observations here, especially about education. I know American school education quite well. It's not that bad, by the way, but it's more about the history, of course, is more about the United States than about the outside world, because the United States actually has a long history. If you think about colonial history, it's several hundred years. Of course, it's not like China, but it's not that short and quite interesting. But what I would like to hear is what to do about all this, because you kind of complained about the United States, basically arguing that it's not perfect. Well, we all know that, but in foreign relations, unless you want to change the United States, I don't think that you are very likely to succeed in this endeavor. But we have to deal with the United States and other countries as they are. So what are actually what is your conclusion, that we cannot build trust with the United States and we cannot deal with it at all, or we can deal on some other basis? For example, I would suggest that you don't even need much trust to deal with other countries. On the contrary, you remember what President Reagan said, "Доверяй, но проверяй," he said, the Russian proverb, which means trust but verify, which basically means that you don't have to trust, you have to verify. Maybe it's even good if you don't trust your kind of opponent. You can, you don't have to trust. You can just check what they are doing, and that's even better for stable relations. There can be such a theory. So what is your recommendation? What China, for example, should do about all that? About all that imperfect the United States?
Yeah, that's thank you for that question. Yeah, that's as I mentioned earlier, the American it is stated American policy is documented that America wants to maintain its hegemony, and I don't know if there's any way to shake that, any way to change that. American society, there are people in American society who understand that, who understand what is going on. Look at the example I quoted, like Henry Kissinger. Kissinger is an old China hand. He's dealt with China for a long time. He was the one instrumental in the rapprochement with China. He went in 1971, opened the way for President Nixon to go in 1972, and he's been to China many times. But he is not influential in the American establishment today. His voice doesn't carry. And there are also a large number. I think you have other China experts in American universities. Some are sympathetic to China. but they don't get invited to speak on CNN or Fox News or interviewed by the New York Times or Washington Post. I mean, you have Jeffrey Sachs, Columbia University, professor of development. He has been very forthright and has spoken his mind. But again, I mean, he's a very well-respected academic. In fact, he gave a lot of advice to Russia during the early years of Russia's perestroika, restructuring. I mean, the reform.
He ruined the Russian economy first, and now became very well behaved for some reason. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think I'm sure he has his regrets about some of his advice. But as I say, you know, he's one of the alternative voices. He's a respected academic, but again, he doesn't get heard. Joe Biden doesn't invite him to the White House to ask for his advice, whether it's on international relations or on domestic affairs. And in America today, you have this bipartisan consensus. It wasn't always like that. I mean, the purpose of the two parties is so that you could have diversity of views. But that's no longer the case now. I mean, as far as foreign policy goes, a lot of the debate, argument between the two sides is on domestic issues. But as far as foreign policy, they seem to be very happy with each other. Trump started a trade war against China, and everybody was thinking, well, maybe when Biden becomes president, things will improve. But it's gotten worse. You know, in America, to run for president, whichever party, you have to prove that you're more pro-China than the previous guy. I mean, sorry, more anti-China than the previous guy. Take a harder line than the previous person when you're running for president. That's how you win votes. And that's only the electoral system. It's about how to get elected. Whether they keep their promises or not is a different story. But it's telling a good story so that you get the votes. I mean, like, look at President Obama. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for what? You know, I mean, he promised during his election that he would withdraw American troops to get them out of the Middle East, but he didn't. I mean, in fact, he increased the number of troops in Afghanistan during his presidency, and also, you know, a drone assassination of people there. So that's only one level, and then you have the other level of the vested interests, the American vested interests. Now, you have different kinds of vested interests. On the one hand, you have a lot of businessmen in America who've made a lot of money in China, and they are in general quite positive about wanting to have a harmonious relationship with China. You know, companies like Nike, Apple phone, as I mentioned, all the fast food chains, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, you know, Boeing makes a lot of money from China, sells some hundreds of aircraft. McDonald's, well, yeah. So there's a lot of money to be made in China, and you know, these are capitalists. These are good capitalists. I mean, you know, good in the sense that they're doing their job, you know, making money, and they made huge fortunes in China. By the way, this is not just 20th century. I mean, a lot of Americans made a lot of money in China 150 years ago. After the Opium War, you know, the trade in silk and trade in tea and so on, and opium. That's where a lot of fortunes were made. I mean, both on the British side as well as on the American side. People don't talk about that nowadays. Because it's such a huge market. Such a huge market. if every if every Chinese were to drink a can of Coca-Cola a day, immense. How much would that cost? Would that be? How much profit would you make?
I hope they are not going to do that.
Bad for your health, right?
Of course.
Yeah. And so, and then you have this, and you have the arms manufacturers, the people who are making arms. They have their vested interest as well, and you see that happening in Ukraine, and of course in the Middle East. A lot of the war is good business. President Eisenhower, in his farewell speech, warned about the military-industrial complex. That is the army, the military, and the arms manufacturers. They work hand in hand. If you are a senior American military officer when you retired, well, guess where do you go? Where you go? You go work for McDonnell Douglas, you go work for Raytheon, you go work for Boeing, you work for these arms companies because you have the connections in the Pentagon. So a lot of this is financial and economic interest. It's very hard to fight against this kind of interest. Because when you have financial power, you get political power. You can buy the congressman. There's a lot of lobbying that's going on in Washington on K Street. Mind you, it's not just America. A lot of so-called liberal democracies have faced that issue as well.
Very true. I think we have a comment from Professor Alexander Vorontsov as well. Professor Vorontsov, would you like to ask that?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Tai, for a very, very insightful consideration. And my question will be maybe in some continuation of the previous questions, but based on your research outcomes, what may be your main focus dealing with future relation between the United States and China? What will be the mainstream trust or mistrust will increase in the shortcoming future? From one side, based on your data and your statistics, many Americans try to learn Chinese language, try to better understand China. But is it will be resulted in the increase in trust or maybe mistrust? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, of course, there's a big asymmetry, as we discussed earlier, between the level, how much one side knows about the other, and so on. So that is a source for concern. Now, I like to talk a little bit about the Chinese side now. Yeah. Now the Chinese, of course, recently there have been, because if you read the Western media, they are talking about Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and China's ambition to become the world leader and so on. Well, the fact is that if you look at Chinese history, China has been pretty much a defensive kind of civilization. I won't call it a country because it's so big. It's in fact, China was made up of over the centuries, it was made up of many different ethnic groups that then became a part of that Chinese civilization, which includes the language and the culture and history, that shared history and culture. But it has never been a kind of sort of imperialistic power, if I may put that way. Its main worries was its main enemies throughout much of its history until the 19th century, when the Europeans came, was fending off the nomadic tribes in the north, in the steppes, the Mongols, the Manchus, what in Europe called the Huns. Yeah, these were very capable fighters. They on horseback archers. They say the Mongol children learn to ride the horse before they can even walk. That kind of a statement. But the fact is that the Chinese army was no match for these cavalry, mounted archers, and so they lost every time they. So that's why they built the Great Wall. The Great Wall was there to prevent the nomadic tribes from attacking China. And of course, the nomadic tribes, why did they attack China? Because as a nomadic tribe, you had to find pasture for your sheep and your goats. And the minute that this area was eaten, the pasture was eaten, you had to find another place. And then sometimes you had bad weather and you can't get pasture. So what can they do? Their only resource was to attack the Chinese, because China was an agrarian agricultural society where they grow crops, they grow rice and wheat and so on, and which they store. And they came and they robbed to take it for survival. So the Chinese had to build that wall to keep them out, but it wasn't always successful. And many times, in fact, these steppe nomadic tribes ruled China for several hundred years. And then of course the Mongols ruled the whole of China for about 100 years, and then the Manchus came later and ruled it for about another 300 years. So you see, China is not a very easy place to defend, and then on top of that, with all the famine and bad weather, the flooding and other calamities that I spoke about. So it was a very hard place to live, very hard to survive as far as international relations was concerned. So sometimes the strategy they did was to basically to bribe, to pay off. You basically just pay off the enemy, and the other one was to marry off princesses to the enemy, and so that you become relatives, you become related as a way to buy peace. And the Chinese army was never very, very big. There was never a sort of a standing army. It was mostly, peasants who were conscripted to fight these wars. So China is it's kind, you can think of it as an inward-looking civilization or inward-looking power, not an outward-looking one. Anytime they tried to expand outwards, like to Central Asia, they lost. So that is the Chinese psyche, and then of course when the Europeans came, the British and the French, that was a big shock. It was a huge shock to them. They didn't even know about. They had no idea where England was, or France. Never heard of it. And suddenly these people showed up, and they had very sophisticated military technology, and which gave them a monopoly of military power for about 200 years, all across the world. So as far as China is concerned, it has no great ambition to, because that mindset is not there. The other example I wanted to quote was Vietnam. China ruled Vietnam for 100 years. For 1,000 years. From the 200 BC, until about 800 AD. It was colonized by the Chinese, and they sent officials there to run the place. There was a lot of intermarriage. a lot of migration by Chinese who intermarried with Vietnamese. So you have a lot of half mixed families for 1,000 years. But the Vietnamese didn't want to be assimilated. They didn't want to be part of the Chinese civilization. And they revolted many times. They fought many wars to drive out the Chinese. And they finally did. So for the Chinese, I think they learned a hard lesson. If you can't assimilate a country after ruling it for 1,000 years, there's not much incentive to try and do that anywhere else. The only time when it assimilated, was able to take in, was when the people, when they expanded, and the people who became part of the country readily accepted Chinese culture, readily accepted the language, the writing, and so on. That was the only way it worked. There had to be a willingness on the part of the new people, and which is what happened even with the Mongols and the Manchus and the other steppe people. First they came in and they conquered China. They were the rulers, but then they assimilated themselves into the Chinese civilization. They became Chinese. So on the question of what the Chinese will do, say, there's a lot of talk about Taiwan, whether Taiwan will become the next Ukraine, whether the Americans will use Taiwan as a staging area to fight the war with China, a proxy war. Yeah? Use the Vietnamese to fight use the Taiwanese to fight the Chinese, the way as what you see is happening in Ukraine. So there's a lot of talk about that. But my view is that, there are two things. On the one hand, the Chinese are not in a hurry to take back Taiwan. It's called reunification. Taiwan is, economically speaking, it's not a big deal for China. It's 20 million people. Perhaps the most precious part of Taiwan is the semiconductor industry. They have a company they call TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor, and they're one of the leading semiconductor producers. But apart from that, there is nothing that Taiwan has that China doesn't. In fact, most Taiwanese businesses have moved to China. They're producing in China, open factories in China because the land is cheaper, the labor cost is cheaper, the market is bigger. So despite all the talk about reunification, they're not in a hurry. Time is on their side. So I don't see them fighting a war with America over Taiwan. And then on the other, from the other side, well, whether America wants a war is another story. You see, with China. There are parts of the Pentagon, the military the national security establishment that want to fight a war with China, basically because this is your chance. You better attack while you still can before China gets even stronger. That is the logic. So there are people who think that way and want to go that way. But I'm not sure if many of the people in the Pentagon are so keen, because they run simulation. They run simulation on war games of a war between China and Taiwan, or China and the US over Taiwan. And 8 out of 9 times they lose. The Americans lose. Because, you have to sail all across the Pacific to fight China. And, they have made important progress in the defense industry, the Chinese. So that's the only thing I see holding the Americans back from a war. I mean, and perhaps the same with I would say it's a parallel situation to the war in Ukraine, because I don't see the Americans putting large numbers of troops there. First of all, I'm not even sure they have the number of troops they, to put on the ground to start a war with Russia.
I think, Professor Tai, there's going to be a topic for another talk or several talks.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to have to break it here. For today, thank you very much for everybody who participated. We're delighted to have you. This is very insightful, thought-provoking indeed. We'll be thinking about many of the things you brought up in your talk. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to conclude our 35th session of the Eurasian seminar. Thank you. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.